Spotlight you, Bobby.
Okay, here we go.
Yep.
So we're going to be focusing on one person, and we're going to be doing nonfiction. And this is thanks in part to Travis and to all of you who are giving us your input. This person, the book is Harriet Tubman. She has a disability. She had two disabilities. One was she had a traumatic brain injury, and that will be talked about in this book and in many books, because this is such a special historical figure, born with these disabilities, traumatic brain injury, and born a slave, that many people have written about her. So we're going to read more than one book about Harriet Tubman. Okay, so we're going to get different people's perspectives, and I think that will give us a better overall view. And Niels has come up with some music that will help all of us also get into the times and life of Harriet Tubman and help us with our discussion about what about her life is striking us personally. So I'm going to start with this first book. Who was Harriet Tubman? No one knows the exact year in which Harriet Tubman was born. It may have been 1820 or 1821. Almost everyone thought the birth of a slave baby wasn't worth remembering. Born a slave, Harriet Tubman grew into a brave and daring young woman. She was brave enough to escape from slavery. Shows a drawing of her leading people to freedom. She was daring enough to help others escape too. Because she led so many to freedom, she was called Moses. Like Moses in the Bible, Harriet Tubman believed that her people should be free, and she risked her life many times to help them become free. Even after she had escaped safely from the South, she went back to help other slaves north to freedom. Here is her story. Chapter 1, Life in Maryland. Sometime around 1820 in Maryland, a slave named Harriet Ross had a baby girl. Neither Harriet, who was called O'Rit, nor her husband Ben could read or write, so they couldn't record the year of the baby's birth. No one else thought it was worth doing, but O'Rit loved her tiny child and wanted to protect her. She hoped her little girl, whose nickname was Minnie, would learn to sew, cook, and weave. Then she could be a home slave and avoid backbreaking work picking crops like tobacco, corn, or wheat in the fields. Okay. O'Rit and Ben had been born slaves. They had many children, all of whom were slaves too. Black people had been slaves in the United States for a long time, ever since 1619, when Blacks from Africa were kidnapped and brought on slave ships to Virginia. Slavery had been a part of American life. By early 1800s, most of the northern states had stopped slavery, but the southern states had not. And here is a picture of a slave ship, and all these little black horizontal figures are slaves that have been packed so tightly into the hulls of the ship. It just gives you some idea of what it was like to do that crossing. Slaves like Ben and O'Rit worked very hard, yet they were not paid for the work. Instead, Ben and O'Rit lived on land owned by their master, a man named Mr. Brodus. This land and the many buildings on it was called a plantation. And that's the beautiful plantation home of the master. Okay. Mr. Brodus' plantation house was large and grand, like so many of those in the South. Ben and O'Rit could see the Brodus big house every day, but they didn't live there. They lived in a log cabin like the other slaves on the plantation. Slaves' cabins were very small. They had no windows. The floors were made of dirt. Piles of worn-out blankets were the only beds. Still, for little Minnie, this was home, and she loved it. There's her house. As soon as she could walk, Minnie joined her brothers and sisters and other slave children who were watched by an older slave. The littlest children ran and played naked. The older ones wore a coarse linen garment. None of them wore shoes. Still, they had fun. Summers were warm and bright. They swam and fished in the many streams and creeks. And even though she was a slave, Minnie was happy. She loved her parents. Ben, her father, told her stories about the woods. He could name the birds, and he knew which berries were sweet and tasty. We are playing. Minnie's mother told her stories from the Bible. From her mother, Minnie learned about Moses. Moses had lived thousands of years before. He led his people, the Hebrews, out of Egypt, where they had been slaves, and into freedom. Around 1826, when Minnie turned 6, her life changed. Mr. Brodus hired her out. This meant that she had to leave her parents and her home. She had to go and live and work for white people who could not afford to buy a slave of their own. The day she had to leave, a wagon came to take her away. Minnie didn't want to go. She was only 6 years old. Her 2 older sisters had been taken away and never come back. She remembered how they cried and cried, but they had to go anyway, and so did Minnie. Minnie worked for a woman named Mrs. Cook. I'm going to show you the wagon that's coming to take her away. That's Mr. Cook, and she's waving goodbye to Ben and Rip. She worked for a woman named Mrs. Cook, who was a weaver. Mrs. Cook spent her days in front of a big noisy loom. Minnie helped her wind the yarn, and the air was filled with fuzz and lint. It made Minnie cough. She dropped the yarn. She couldn't concentrate. Mrs. Cook got so angry. When she was angry, she would punish Minnie by whipping her. Slaves were often whipped. That was how the masters made them behave. Mrs. Cook told her husband that Minnie was stupid and slow, so Mr. Cook had her help him instead. He was trying to catch muskrats. He set out traps by the river. It was Minnie's job to watch them. It was cold in the river, but it was quiet too. The air was clear and fresh. Let me show you this. She is Mrs. Cook trying to operate the loom, and there's all the dust and fuzz in the air. And there she is. She's watching Mr. Cook tell her how to catch the muskrats. One day, Minnie woke up feeling sick. Mrs. Cook thought she was pretending so she wouldn't have to work. Just as always, Mr. Cook sent Minnie out to check the traps. She went down to the river, shivering with a fever. When she got back, Mrs. Cook saw she was really sick. She sent Minnie home to her parents to get well. Lit took care of Minnie for 6 weeks, but then it was back to Mrs. Cook and the loom. Minnie could not learn to do the job, so the cook sent her home again. Next, Mr. Broadus hired Minnie out to a woman named Miss Susan. Minnie, who was only about 7 years old, had to watch Miss Susan's baby. If the baby cried, Minnie was whipped. At night, she sat by the baby's cradle and rocked it gently. But Minnie was tired. She would fall asleep and the baby would begin to cry. Then Miss Susan would get angry at being woken, and Minnie was whipped again. Minnie learned to stay alert for the baby, but it was hard and she was always tired. And there's Minnie when she's sick with the fever and she's sitting home to her mama. And there she is, only 7 years old, and she's watching the baby all through the night. And there's the cradle she's rocking. Once, when Mrs. Susan's back was turned, Minnie reached for a lump of sugar that was in a bowl on the table. She had never tasted sugar. Slaves were rarely given candy or treats. It looked so good, but Miss Susan saw her. Furious, she reached for the whip. Minnie was too fast. Out the door she flew. She did not stop running until she was sure Miss Susan was no longer chasing her. But now what? If she went back, she would face a whipping. Minnie found a pig pen. She crawled inside to hide. She was very young, but she was very bold. She tried to fight the piglets for potato peelings and other scraps of food, but the mother pig pushed Minnie away. After 5 days, Minnie was filthy and starving. She knew she would have to return to her mistress. Later, Minnie would say, "I didn't have anywhere else to go, even though I knew what was coming." And there she is. She's reaching for the sugar, and she's running out the door because Miss Susan's got the whip in her hand. And there's Minnie inside the pig pen. And she wants some of the potato peelings and scraps that the other pigs were getting. The mother pig pushed her away. Instead of being hired out again, Minnie was sent back to Mr. Brodess. Now Minnie had to work in the fields, which was very hard. She split logs, loaded wood into wagons, worked the plow, and drove oxen. Minnie had grown strong and sturdy. She could do the jobs, and when she was in the fields, she could see the sky and feel the wind. The other slaves talked while they worked. That was how Minnie began to hear new ideas. And it shows a picture of her splitting the logs with the other men. Okay. She heard about slaves who said they wanted to be free. Some of them had escaped from the plantation. They went north to freedom. Others, like Nat Turner, started rebellions to end slavery. Nat Turner was caught and killed, but his ideas didn't die. More and more slaves thought about being free. Late one day in 1834, Mr. Brodess' slave gathered with the slaves from another plantation to shuck the corn. They sang while they worked, peeling the pale green husks from the golden ears of corn. One slave stood apart, and Minnie watched him. He began moving across the big field. At first, the overseer, the man who kept the slaves in line, did not notice. The slave was halfway across when the overseer saw him. He shouted for him to return, but the man kept going. The overseer followed, holding his big whip. Minnie followed too. The overseer was running now, chasing the escaped slave. So here they are. They're husking the corn, and there's the one slave that's trying to disappear into the cornfield. The slave ducked into a store. The overseer ran after him. The slave was cornered in the store. The overseer called to Minnie. He wanted her to help him tie up the runaway slave, but Minnie didn't move. She stood watching the two men. Suddenly, the slave pushed past the overseer and was out the door, gone. As for Minnie, she stood in front of the doorway so that the overseer could not follow the slave. The overseer picked up a heavy 2-pound weight and threw it at the runaway. The weight missed the runaway slave, but it hit Minnie on the forehead. She fell unconscious and bleeding. She was brought to old Rit, her mom, who nursed her tenderly. No one thought Minnie would live. Still, old Rit cared for her daughter night and day. Eventually, Minnie recovered from the wound, although it left a scar on her forehead. It wasn't just a scar that made Minnie different now. People treated her with respect. Although she was only 13 or 14, she had defied an overseer. No longer was she called by her childhood nickname of Minnie. Instead, she was called Harriet, her mother's name. Clearly, she was not a child anymore. And there's the overseer telling her, "Get out of the way, Minnie." But she stood blocking the doorway. And when he threw the weight, it hit Minnie up here on her forehead. Looking for the North Star, Chapter 2. Harriet was not the same after she got well. She suffered from headaches. Sometimes she had sleeping spells. One minute she might be awake and talking, and the next minute she'd be sound asleep. These spells frightened her. She heard a rumor. Mr. Brodess, her master, was going to sell her. He would sell some of her brothers too. What would happen to her? She might be sent further south to New Orleans, Louisiana, or Natchez, Mississippi, in a chain gang. In a chain gang, the slaves were chained together at the ankles to prevent their escape. The trip south would be long and hard. If Harriet fell asleep on the road, the overseer would whip her. He might whip her very hard and leave her to die. Her brothers would not be able to save her. And even if she could survive the trip, Harriet knew that being sold someplace further south was a bad thing. That was where so many of the cotton plantations were. And this is the chain gang, and you can see that people are chained together. These are the ankles. And there's the overseer, okay? He's watching everything they do. Working in the cotton fields was very hard work. Also, going further south meant she'd be further from the northern states, further from freedom. Harriet did not want to be a slave all of her life. She wanted desperately to be free. Harriet began to pray that Mr. Brodess would die. To her amazement, he did get sick and die, and Harriet found she was very sorry for having prayed that. She believed it was wrong to have prayed for his death, but now she had a new owner who was more fair. His name was Dr. Anthony Thompson. Dr. Thompson hired Harriet and her father out to a builder named John Stewart. At first, she swept, dusted, washed clothes, and made the beds in Mr. Stewart's house. There she is. She's washing clothes in a bucket. But Harriet hated the work and asked if she could work outside with the men. Mr. Stewart agreed. Harriet worked alongside the men, cutting down trees and splitting logs. She was such a good worker that sometimes Mr. Stewart let her take outside jobs. She even earned some money for her work. She had to give Mr. Stewart part of the money, but she could keep some of it. Harriet looked for more outdoor work, hauling logs, driving an ox cart, plowing fields. Harriet worked 5 years for that builder. She became even stronger and more capable. She was more than 21 years old now, all grown up. Her father kept teaching her things too. He taught her how to move through the woods without making a sound. He showed her how to find the North Star near the Big Dipper. The North Star was the guiding light for slaves. It showed the way north, the way to freedom. Ben told his daughter that with the North Star in sight, you would know you were headed in the right direction. But what if it was cloudy and the stars were hidden? Okay, first I'm going to show you the picture of Harriet getting money, but having to give some to Mr. Stewart. And here's her father, Ben, pointing out the North Star, the way to freedom. But what if it was cloudy and the stars were hidden? Ben told his daughter to feel the trees for moss. Moss grew only on the north sides of trees. Even without the North Star, the moss could help a traveler. Harriet listened to what her father had to say. She remembered his words, and in time, they would help her. It's going to be the last chapter of this book. It's chapter 3, and there's Harriet working on a quilt. A free man's wife. In 1844, when she was about 23, Harriet fell in love with John Tubman. John's parents had been slaves, but their master freed his slaves when he died. So John was born free. John and Harriet made plans to marry. Harriet was making a quilt. She sewed it from different scraps of cloth. Sewing was hard work for Harriet. She wasn't used to holding a needle. It was so tiny. Again and again, she dropped it, and it's hard to find a needle on the dirt floor. Still, she kept working till the quilt was done. The finished quilt had many colors: yellow, purple, white, and green. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. When she married John and went to live in his cabin, she took the quilt with her. John was happy with their life. He loved Harriet and liked the money she made. They had a cabin of their own and life was good. But Harriet was not so content. What if her new owner wanted to sell her? She and John would be separated. She still thought about escaping. She begged John to go north with her. They would follow the North Star. And in the north, Harriet would be a free woman, and they both would be free. And here's Harriet's quilt. And there's John Tubman and Harriet in their house. But John did not want to leave home. It was too dangerous. What would they eat? How would they live? He told Harriet to put escaping out of her mind, but she could not do that. She told him about the dreams she had, dreams of freedom. John told Harriet if she tried to escape, he would tell the master. After that, Harriet began to fear her husband. John did not share her dream. If she wanted to be free, she would have to go north without him. One day, Harriet was working in a field close to the road. A white woman drove up in a buggy. She wore the plain clothes of a Quaker. She began to talk to Harriet. She asked Harriet her name and knew how she got the scar on her forehead. Harriet knew that Quakers did not believe in slavery. She could talk to this woman. She could trust her. The woman came again on other days. If no one was watching them, they spoke. She told Harriet that if she ever needed help, she could ask her. In 1849, bad news came to the plantation. Harriet and some of her family were to be sold. Sold? Now she had to escape. She told her brothers, and they made a plan. I'm going to show you the picture of the buggy. And there's the Quaker lady talking to Harriet and telling Harriet if she needed help, she would help her. So this is a plan that her brothers made. They were going to leave. That night, she waited until John was asleep, and then she went to meet her brothers. They moved through the woods, but how much noise her brothers made. They weren't quiet like Harriet knew to be. They grew frightened. Escape was too risky. They were going to go back. Harriet had to come with them, but she said no. She wanted to go on alone, but they would not let her. She tried to fight them, but they were bigger and stronger, and they forced her to return. In 2 nights, the slave trader would be coming for Harriet and her brothers. Harriet faced a hard choice. If she stayed, she would be put on a chain gang. She would probably die on a long walk south. But if she escaped, who would go with her? Not her husband, John, not her brothers. And she decided to run away all by herself. She went to bed as usual, but in the middle of the night, she woke up and began to pack. Packing was easy. She put a little salt pork and cornbread in the bandana and took the quilt she had made. She didn't dare take more. Harriet slipped out of the house. Finally, she was on her way to freedom, on her way north. Harriet was going to make her dream come true. And here she is. She's leaving everything she knows, just with this little bundle and a little light, a little lantern. Okay, I'm gonna stop that book. Now I'm gonna read from another author. And this is beautifully illustrated. And it's by Jacob Lawrence. And he wrote the story and he did the paintings. And this is Harriet. Okay, this is a picture of the real Harriet. Right, there she is. She's older. It's a picture of her when she was, I think, in her 40s. I'm gonna have to verify that to you guys. Okay, but this is what she looked like. This is the image that most of us remember, or when we're reading about her life. This is the image that's given a lot of the photograph that was taken of her. Okay, so here's a picture of her as a little girl. All right. Again, this is by Jacob Lawrence. It's called Harriet and the Promised Land. Harriet, born a slave. A little bitty baby. And there's her dad and Ben. And there's old Red. And there's the baby they called Minty. Work for your master from your cradle to your grave. That was the life of a slave. Okay. The splitting of the wood, washing of the clothes, everything that had to be done. Okay. Toting the water. Okay. Working on the plantation, working in the field. Harriet clean, Harriet sweet, Harriet rock that child to sleep. Remember, she was 6 years old. And she had to take care of that baby. Okay. Harriet, hear tell about the promised land, how Moses led the slaves over Egypt's sand, how Pharaoh's heart was hard as stone, how the Lord told Moses he was not alone. And this is her mother telling her stories from the Bible. And there's Harriet listening. When Harriet grew up, she was called the Moses of her people. Harriet prayed to the Lord at night for strength to free your people when the time is right. Okay, remember the story that we just read when Harriet was 7 years old and she ran to the pig pen so that her mistress wouldn't with her anymore. Okay, that picture shows, I think, Harriet in the pig pen right there. She learned to pray for her mom. Harriet grow bigger, Harriet grow stronger, Harriet work harder, Harriet work longer. And here's Harriet in the house. And there's Harriet out in the field with the men. And she's getting stronger and stronger every year. Then Harriet got the sign. The time was right. She cried, brothers and sisters, I'll lead you tonight. Harriet dressed in white, and she's pointing to the North Star up there. The North Star shone to light Harriet's way, and they marched by night, and they slept by day. Some were afraid, but none turned back, for close at their heels how the bloodhounds pack. Let's see. There's Harriet. There's the North Star. No matter what's in the way, she's sure that God is leading them. And she always trusted they would get it up north safely. A snake said, and the owl said, whoo. Harriet said, we're coming through. A runaway slave with a price on her head. I'll be free, said Harriet, or I'll be dead. A lot of action going on in this picture. There's Harriet pointing again to the North Star, and there's the people that she's leading on this trip. And there's the different animals in the woods. And they're crossing the stream. And there's a woman with the little baby. Okay. She said, believe in the Lord. She said, believe in me. She said, brothers and sisters, we're gonna be free. They slept in a barn with a barnyard fowl, and Harriet kept watch like a barnyard owl. Okay, there's Harriet, reassuring everyone they're gonna make it. And there they are resting, but not Harriet. She's watching over all of them all the time. Good people gave them food to eat and a chance to rest their weary feet. They gave Harriet chickens to disguise the runaway slave from spying eyes. And there's a man, he's helping Harriet take off her socks and bathe her feet. And there's people sitting at the table, finally getting a good hot meal. And there's those chickens. It's a whole nother story on one of the trips. It's exactly what she did. She had chickens in a basket to disguise who she was. Then the north wind howled like a bloodhound pack, but none were afraid and none turned back. Harriet led them across the snow towards the promised land as Moses led his people across the burning sand. So they're up north now, and it has snowed. This we know about. And there's Harriet. She says, we're gonna make it. You gotta trust the good Lord. And there's the North Star. Still the North Star is shining. They marched through the cold and they marched through the heat, and the only sound was their marching feet. Now they marched by day, now they marched by night. Still the promised land was not in sight. Now Harriet grew weary and sick of heart. But now the Lord sent Harriet a chariot. It was like a wagon that would help speed them on their way. Okay. And in this illustration, there is a horse pulling, and that's their chariot. It's an old farm wagon. Everybody got in to take a rest. And the chariot was sent by the Lord's own hand, and Harriet rode the chariot to the promised land. Harriet, Harriet, born to be free, led her people to liberty. And there is Harriet. She has the reins now of the horse. And there's the folks she has in the wagon. And they're calling it a chariot. And they finally made it up north, way up in Canada they went. So that's the end of our story. And I just have one more point to share, okay? This is the third writer that we're going to be doing today. And again, talking about Harriet. And these are pictures from engravings that were done about life as a slave, okay? Helping in the house, okay? Helping, this is with cotton. Helping on the field, okay, they're hoeing. Okay, this is hauling wood. Again, working in the cotton fields, all right? And here's the poem about Harriet. And this is that photograph, okay, I was referring to. Okay, here she is. It's a very, very, just a few photographs of Harriet Tubman. This is the most famous. It's the conductor was a woman, and it's dedicated to Harriet Tubman. This line ain't got no tracks. This road ain't got no rails. Bloodhounds are howling, hunting for her trail. The stations are hideouts. The conductor holds a gun. She stops at each plantation for slaves on the run. Hear her whistle blowing, hoot owl at break of dawn. Loose those chains and shackles, tell not a soul you're gone. Steal away with the rags upon your back. Run until your bare feet bleed. Her train won't jump the track. Don't let nobody turn her around. She's been through fire and rain. The North Star is the headlight on her freedom train. Okay, that's from a collection, Remember the Bridge. Okay, and that's by Carol Boston Weatherford. So those are the stories, and I want to hear your reactions. And I think Niels has some music for us that will go along with these stories.